The hug that changed the world years passed, and the world around James Holloway changed in ways no one could have predicted. Once he had been the man on magazine covers for his wealth, for his ruthless business moves, for his unshakable empire, but now people spoke of him differently. They no longer measured him by billions or boardroom victories. They measured him by the lives he touched, the projects he built for children, the shelters that bore his name not as monuments of ego, but as havens of hope. They remembered the speeches he gave where his voice trembled with sincerity rather than power, and above all, they remembered the story of the billionaire who had stopped in the middle of a park one winter morning and listened. When a little girl offered him a hug, Maya grew, her once small frame blossoming into a young woman, her laughter still the same, bright sound that had once cut through the frost of James's loneliness. She thrived not because of luxury but because of love. Her mother, still steady and strong, worked fewer hours now. The weight of survival lifted as James had quietly built opportunities for her and for countless others like her. Their apartment had changed not to a mansion, but to a home filled with warmth and security. James visited often, and though the cameras still followed, they no longer twisted the story. They now told it as proof that even the coldest of hearts could be thawed. James himself had changed more than anyone could have imagined. The sharp edges of ambition that once defined him had softened, not into weakness, but into strength of a different kind. He still walked into rooms where deals were made, but he no longer saw those deals as battles to win. He saw them as chances to build, chances to heal. His rivals still existed, but their weapons no longer cut him the way they once did, because he knew that even if he lost every coin, he had already gained something they could never touch. One evening, years after that first meeting, James sat in a quiet hall where children's laughter echoed. The grand opening of a new community center funded by his foundation. The air was filled with music and joy. Balloons floated, little hands tugged at his sleeve to thank him, and in the middle of it all, Maya stood at his side, taller now. Her smile radiant, she spoke to the crowd with the same steady voice she had once used as a child, telling them that kindness had power, that sometimes the smallest act could change a life. And as she spoke, James felt tears sting his eyes, because he knew she was right. Later that night, when the crowd had gone and the hall was quiet, James sat alone at a table, his wrist still carrying the same bracelet. The yarn frayed now, the beads scratched, but he had never taken it off. It had traveled with him through storms, through betrayals, through losses and victories. It was a reminder of the moment his life had turned. As he looked at it under the dim light, he whispered softly, "That hug saved me." He remembered the man he had been before, the cold, untouchable billionaire locked behind walls of glass. He remembered the emptiness that no amount of money could fill. And he remembered the way a little girl had looked at him without fear, without judgment, and offered him something priceless, the chance to feel human again. From that day forward, James Holloway was no longer remembered only for his wealth. He was remembered as the man who proved that compassion could change the course of a life. He was remembered as the man who had fallen, and in falling had discovered something greater than success. And in quiet corners of the city, people told their children the story of how a billionaire had been saved by the hug of a little girl named Maya, and so the story lived on, not as scandal, not as business gossip, but as a reminder that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can heal the deepest wounds, sometimes the most fragile bracelet can carry the greatest weight, and sometimes a simple hug can change not only a man but the world around him. The great fall and rise storms in business were nothing new to James Holloway. He had built his empire by outmaneuvering rivals, by surviving crises that would have broken lesser men. He had weathered stock crashes, lawsuits, betrayals. Yet the storm he now faced was unlike any before. This was not about numbers on a balance sheet. This was about perception, about reputation, about the image that had been carefully crafted over decades. And now that image was under fire. The tabloids screamed headlines every day. The networks replayed grainy footage of him carrying groceries alongside Maya and her mother. Commentators debated whether the billionaire had lost his edge, whether he was being manipulated, whether he was fit to lead anymore. In the boardrooms, the whispers grew louder. Some allies turned into doubters. Rivals sharpened their knives. The empire that once felt unshakable now swayed like a tower in the wind. Yet James, for the first time in his life, felt strangely calm, because deep inside he had discovered something he had never had before. A reason beyond wealth, beyond power. He had discovered connection. He had discovered love, and for that he was willing to risk it all. The breaking point came when he announced a new project. Instead of another skyscraper or global merger, he declared that his company would invest hundreds of millions into community projects for children, schools, shelters, food programs. He spoke of it openly, saying that no empire had value if it did not lift those who had nothing. The reaction was instant and brutal. Shareholders panicked, stock prices dropped, directors accused him of recklessness, some even demanded his resignation. For days he fought on every front. Long meetings stretched into nights. Phones buzzed with threats of walkouts. His empire trembled closer to collapse. And through it all he returned, again and again, to that small apartment, where the air smelled of home-cooked meals, where Maya's laughter cut through the darkness, where her mother's steady eyes reminded him that there was still strength in simplicity. But even there the shadows followed. The cameras never left. The whispers never stopped. One evening, after a brutal meeting where half his board threatened to vote him out, he returned to the apartment. Exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes dark. With worry, he sat heavily on the couch, his face buried in his hands. Maya climbed up beside him, silent for once, watching him with those wide, unblinking eyes. After a long moment, she asked softly, "Are they being mean to you?" The question, so innocent, so unpolished, broke something in him. He gave a hollow laugh, then whispered, "Yes, they are, and I don't know if I can win this time." Without hesitation, Maya leaned against him, her small arms wrapping around his shoulders. The same simple act that had first pierced his heart weeks ago. "Hugs don't fix everything," she whispered, repeating the words her mother had once told her. "But they help." James closed his eyes, his chest tightening, and for the first time in his long career, he let the tears fall freely. Not in secret, not in shame, but openly. With a child's arms around him, that hug did not change the numbers. It did not erase the doubts of shareholders or silence the journalists, but it gave him something far greater. It gave him the strength to rise again, the strength to face them not with fear, but with truth. The next morning he walked into the boardroom, shoulders straight, eyes clear, wearing not his usual silk tie, but the bright little bracelet still tied around his wrist. The directors sneered, ready for battle. But before they could speak, James did. He told them plainly that he would not abandon the path he had chosen, that if they wanted to remove him, they could, but he would rather lose his empire than lose his soul. His words stunned the room. The same man who had once been known for his ruthless ambition now spoke with the calm fire of conviction. Some walked out, others muttered in anger. The stock dropped further, his rivals celebrated. It seemed to the world that James Holloway was finished. Yet beyond the noise, beyond the falling numbers, something else was stirring. People outside. The boardrooms began to listen. Families, workers, teachers, ordinary citizens who had never cared about his name before, now saw a man standing for something beyond profit. They began to speak of him differently, not as a cold billionaire, but as a man who remembered what it meant to be human. For weeks he lived in the eye of the storm, his empire stripped to its bones, his rivals circling like vultures. But through it all he carried himself with quiet strength. Every night he returned to Maya and her mother. Every night he reminded himself why he had chosen this path. He had fallen, yes, but in that fall he discovered a rise far greater than any stock chart could ever measure. And as he stood once again at the window of his penthouse, the lights of the city stretching endlessly below, he realized that though he had lost billions, he had gained something priceless. A sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and the knowledge that no matter what the world took from him, he would never again be empty inside. The world finds out. The fragile balance that James had found with Maya and her mother could not remain hidden for long. The world he lived in was not one of quiet streets and unnoticed evenings. It was a world of flashing cameras, hungry journalists, and whispers that traveled faster than truth. For weeks he had slipped away from his office, from his glittering tower, to spend time in that modest apartment. Sometimes he would help carry groceries. Sometimes he would sit at their small table listening to Maya chatter about her drawings or school. Sometimes he would simply walk with them to the park, feeling for the first time in years that he was part of something that was not built on profit. Yet even as those moments warmed him, shadows began to creep closer. One night, as they left the grocery store together, Maya tugging on his sleeve with her endless stream of questions, he noticed the flicker of a camera lens from across the street. At first he ignored it, telling himself it was nothing, but days later the photographs appeared, splashed across tabloids and online articles. The billionaire seen walking with a woman and a child in a poor neighborhood. The images were grainy but unmistakable. The headlines twisted the story into something it was not. They called it a secret family. They speculated about scandal. They questioned his motives. The reaction was immediate. Board members called him in shock. Advisors urged him to release a statement. Rivals smirked as they whispered that he was losing control. Investors panicked at the sight of uncertainty. James sat in silence as the storm grew louder, his phone buzzing endlessly, his name trending online, and through it all he kept looking at the bracelet on his wrist, reminding himself of the only truth that mattered. When he returned to the apartment that evening, the atmosphere was heavy. Maya greeted him with her usual smile, but her mother stood stiffly, holding a newspaper folded under her arm. Her voice was firm as she asked what he had brought into their lives. Her eyes burned with worry, not for herself, but for her daughter. James listened, guilt flooding through him. He explained that he had never meant for their lives to be touched by his world, that he had only wanted to be present, to give, to share. Her gaze softened slightly at his words, but the tension did not vanish. Yet the most unexpected response came from Maya, who looked at her mother, then at James, and said in her simple way, "He is my friend, that's all." Those words, spoken without hesitation, carried more power than any statement drafted by a team of lawyers. They silenced the argument for the moment, reminding them that beyond the noise of the world, there was something real and simple binding them together. Still, the noise outside grew. Reporters camped near the building, neighbors whispered. The once quiet street became restless. James faced questions everywhere he went. In boardrooms, in interviews, in charity galas. Men in suits asked if he had lost his mind. Women, in polished dresses, whispered about scandal. His empire began to tremble under the weight of gossip. Yet for the first time, he did not feel the need to defend himself. He knew that the truth was not what they imagined. The truth was simpler, purer. The board demanded explanations. Some argued that his involvement with ordinary strangers was damaging to the brand. One evening, in a room filled with polished wood and sharp voices, he stood silently while they hurled accusations. When at last they demanded he cut ties, that he walk away, he raised his wrist, showing the bracelet, and said in a calm voice that shocked them all, "If this is what damages me, then maybe I deserve to be damaged." The room fell into silence. No one had ever heard him speak with such conviction. Of course, the media frenzy only grew, but something else began to happen. People who had read the twisted headlines began to see more than scandal. They saw a man who had always seemed untouchable now, walking hand in hand with a child who smiled at him without fear. They saw photographs of him carrying grocery bags, holding an umbrella over the mother while rain poured, bending down to listen to Maya's stories, and slowly the narrative began to shift. Whispers of scandal turned into curiosity, and curiosity turned into something else. Perhaps admiration. For James, none of that mattered as much as the quiet moments, the evenings when Maya would fall asleep on the couch, her small head resting on his arm, the dinners where laughter filled the air in a way he had not heard in years, the quiet nods of trust from her mother as he proved again and again that he was not there for pity or for show. He was there because he needed them as much as they needed him. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. Storms never ended quickly. And as the cameras followed, as rivals plotted, as his empire trembled, he also knew one thing clearly. He was no longer the man who measured life by numbers alone. He was a man who had something worth standing for, even if the world tried to take it away. The wall begins to break, days stretched into weeks. Yet James could not shake the weight of what he had seen outside that worn apartment. It lingered in his mind during meetings, during dinners. Even in the rare moments of quiet he allowed himself. The image of Maya's wide smile, her mother's tired but protective eyes, and that small doorway into a world so different from his own haunted him. He had spent years building walls so tall and so strong that no one could ever climb them. He had told himself that walls were necessary, that they protected him from loss, from betrayal, from the ache of being vulnerable. Yet now he found those walls weakening, not by force, not by enemies, but by the simple kindness of a child who had seen him as nothing more than a man who needed a hug. He found excuses to walk through that neighborhood more often, telling himself it was just a diversion, just a curiosity. But deep down he knew. It was more. Sometimes he would see Maya playing near the steps, her laughter ringing through the street like sunlight cutting through clouds. She would wave at him without hesitation, her joy untainted by the awareness of who he was. Other times he would see her mother, struggling with heavy bags or hurrying to catch a bus, her eyes always cautious when they landed on him, but less sharp than before, as if she was slowly beginning to accept that he meant no harm. One evening, fate pushed them closer. It was late. The street lamps flickered, and Maya was sitting on the curb near the apartment holding her knees to her chest. James noticed her as he passed, concern flashing instantly. He stopped, knelt beside her, and asked gently why she was sitting out in the cold. She looked up, her cheeks flushed, and said softly that her mother was late coming home from work, that sometimes it happened but she always came back. James felt his chest tighten at the words, memories of his own childhood returning unbidden, nights when he too had waited for his mother to return from double shifts, nights when fear crept in until the sound of the door finally opening gave him peace. He sat beside her, not knowing why, just knowing he could not leave her alone. "Do you trust she will come back?" he asked quietly. And Maya nodded. "Always," she said, her voice steady. "She always comes back. She works so hard. She says everything she does is for me." The simple certainty in her words struck him. It was the kind of trust he had, lost long ago, and he envied it. Minutes later, her mother appeared, her face flushed with worry when she saw Maya on the curb. Her eyes hardened when they fell on James, suspicion tightening her voice as she asked what he was doing there. James rose slowly, explaining that he had simply kept Maya company, that he had not wanted her to sit alone. For a moment it seemed the woman would scold him, demand he leave them alone forever. But then Maya tugged on her sleeve, whispering that he had been kind, that he had stayed. The woman's face softened ever so slightly. Though the caution never fully left her eyes, she gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of his presence. After that night, the air between them changed, not completely, but enough. James found himself welcomed, not warmly but not pushed away either. Maya would often run up to him when she saw him, tugging at his sleeve, showing him the little drawings she had made or telling him about school. She spoke without hesitation, without fear of being judged, and James listened, truly listened, something he had not done with anyone in years. It amazed him how much life could be hidden in the words of a child, how much truth could be spoken without pretense. Her mother remained guarded, but there were moments when her eyes revealed gratitude, like when James carried a heavy bag for her without being asked, or when he quietly paid for groceries at the store after she fumbled with coins at the register. At first she resisted, trying to refuse his help, her pride unwilling to accept charity, but James was careful. He never made her feel small. He never flaunted his wealth. He simply offered, gently, and over time she began to allow it, though she always with a look that warned him not to mistake kindness for weakness. It was during one of those evenings, sitting together in the dim glow of the apartment's small kitchen, that Maya asked him the question he had dreaded. "Why are you always sad?" Her voice was curious, not accusing, but it cut through him sharper than any blade. He tried to smile, tried to brush it aside, but her wide eyes demanded truth. And so, for the first time in years, he spoke of the shadows he had carried. He told her about working so hard that he had lost people he loved, about choosing money over moments, about the emptiness that came when success could not replace what he had thrown away. He did not speak with details. He did not name names, but his voice trembled with the weight of regret. Maya listened quietly, her small hands folded on the table. When he finished, she reached across and touched his wrist where the bracelet still rested. "Then you should not run anymore," she said softly. "If hugs help, then being with people helps even more." The simplicity of her words stunned him. What she said was so obvious, yet he had spent years denying it, hiding from it. And here it was spoken by a child with the wisdom of someone far beyond her years. In that moment, James realized something. He had thought he was the one giving, thought he was the one offering help and support, but the truth was the opposite. He was the one being healed, slowly, piece by piece, by the presence of this little girl and her quiet, strong mother. His walls, once so impenetrable, were beginning to crack, not by force but by love that night. As he walked back to his tower of glass and steel, he made himself a promise. Not a promise of wealth, not of business victories, but a simple human promise. He would not run from kindness anymore. He would not let fear keep him locked behind walls. He would stand, he would feel, even if it hurt. Because maybe, just maybe, the pain of being open was far better than the emptiness of being alone. The hidden struggles. The days after that second meeting passed slowly for James, though in truth it was not the world that slowed. It was him. He found himself lingering on thoughts he once would have dismissed without hesitation. The bracelet on his wrist had become a constant reminder. Each time his sleeve slipped back, each time the soft yarn brushed against his skin, he felt the presence of the little girl who had spoken words that no one else dared to say. He wore it even in board meetings, surrounded by men and women in tailored suits who looked at him with confusion. They whispered among themselves. But he did not care. For the first time in years, he felt that he carried something more real than all their contracts combined. Still, there was a restlessness in him. He could not silence the questions that stirred in his mind about Maya and her mother, their tired eyes, their worn clothes, the heavy grocery bag that seemed far too large for the woman to carry alone. Those small details gnawed at him, not because he pitied them. Pity was too shallow for what he felt, but because he saw in them a reflection of something long forgotten, a shadow of his own past. He remembered his mother coming home late, her hands raw from long hours, her smile stretched thin to hide exhaustion. He remembered the sound of coins clinking into a jar on the counter, every cent saved, every cent counted. James had told himself for years that he had left all that behind, that he had climbed so high above his beginnings that he no longer needed to look back. But seeing Maya and her mother was like looking into a mirror that revealed not his present but his origins. It disturbed him, and yet it pulled him closer. One evening, unable to resist the gnawing in his chest, he found himself in his car, his driver waiting at the curb outside Central Park. James gave no explanation. He simply asked to be driven slowly through the neighborhood near the park. His eyes scanned the streets, watching figures hurry home through the cold, watching lights flicker on in cramped apartments. His mind searching, though he did not know exactly for what. And then he saw them. A small figure skipping clumsily. A larger figure walking behind with weary steps. His chest tightened. He told the driver to stop, but not too close. He did not want to be seen. He watched as Maya and her mother entered an old apartment building. Its bricks cracked, windows patched with plastic where glass had broken. The metal door groaned as it closed behind them. James sat back in his seat, silence pressing heavy in the car. He had expected to feel relief now that he knew where they lived, but instead he felt something deeper, something heavier. Over the next few days, he returned more than once, always from a distance, always watching quietly. He saw Maya leaving. In the mornings, holding her mother's hand as they walked toward a small school 2 blocks away. He saw her mother return alone, rushing off again hours later, perhaps to work. Always with the same tired look, he saw the small details that spoke volumes, the second-hand coats, the boots that didn't fit, the grocery bags that seemed too thin to hold enough food. He understood more without a single word being spoken. They were surviving, not living. The discovery unsettled him. He had the power to change their lives with a single signature, a single gesture, and yet he hesitated. He told himself he did not want to intrude. He told himself it would be arrogant to step into their lives uninvited. But beneath those excuses was fear. Fear of what it would mean to feel connected. Fear of what it would mean to open his heart again. He had built his empire on control, but this feeling was not something he could control. One night, after watching them disappear into their apartment, he returned to his own towering glass penthouse. The contrast struck him so hard it made his stomach churn. He stood in the center of his vast living room, staring at the city skyline, the windows stretching higher than the walls of the building he had just seen. And yet, despite all this space, despite all this wealth, he felt smaller than he ever had. He wondered what Maya's mother thought when she tucked her daughter into bed. Did she worry every night about rent, about groceries, about keeping her safe? James realized he had not worried about survival in decades, and yet in this moment, he envied her because she still had love. She still had someone to hold on to at the end of the day. Sleep did not come to him easily. When it did, it came with dreams, dreams of his own childhood, of his mother singing softly while folding laundry, of meals stretched thin but filled with warmth, of moments when love mattered more than comfort. And when he woke, there was always the bracelet, bright against his skin, a reminder of the girl who had pierced his carefully built shell. At last, the urge became too strong. One late afternoon he walked, not drove, to the neighborhood, his expensive shoes clicking against cracked sidewalks, his tailored coat too fine for the streets around him. He felt out of place, but he pressed forward, stopping outside the building he had seen. He stood there longer than he intended, unsure if he should go in, unsure what he would say if he did. And just as he turned to leave, the door creaked open. Maya stepped out, her small frame bundled in her oversized coat. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. "You came," she said with the kind of joy that made his chest ache. Before he could reply, her mother appeared behind her holding a worn bag filled with laundry. Her face tightened when she saw James, suspicion flickering instantly. "Come inside, Maya," she said firmly, her hand pressing gently on her daughter's shoulder, but Maya resisted, turning back to James. "Did the bracelet help?" she asked brightly. James looked at her, then at her mother, and for the first time he spoke words that felt unpolished, uncalculated. "Yes, more than you know," he said, his voice low. The mother's eyes studied him, and though her expression remained guarded, there was a faint softening, as if she too recognized something human beneath the suit, something fragile beneath the billionaire's mask. She gave a short nod before guiding her daughter inside, and the door closed with a dull thud, leaving James standing alone again on the frozen sidewalk. But even as he turned away, he knew this was not the end. Something had begun, something he could not walk away from. The bracelet's weight. James Holloway had spent most of his adult life measuring value in numbers. Numbers had built his empire. Numbers had given him status, and numbers had given him the illusion of control. But now, sitting in his penthouse, office high above the city, he stared at something that had no number at all. The little bracelet of yarn and plastic beads lay on his desk, so out of place among the sleek screens, glass tables, and silver pens. His assistants had delivered contracts worth millions that morning. His lawyers had called about deals that stretched across continents, but none of it had held his attention the way this small, childlike circle of thread did. He picked it up, again turning it slowly in his hand. It was rough, uneven, some beads scratched, the yarn slightly frayed. He imagined small fingers pushing the beads together, knotting the ends, probably with the help of a mother who smiled patiently as her daughter worked. The thought struck something deep in him, a memory buried under years of neglect. He remembered a time when he too had been small, growing up in a narrow house where the heater rattled all winter. His mother had worked 2 jobs, coming home late but never forgetting to smile when he showed her the crooked paper airplanes he had folded. She used to say, "It doesn't have to be perfect, James. It just has to be made with heart." He had not thought of those words in decades, not since he had buried himself in work, chasing numbers and prestige, telling himself that perfection was the only measure of worth. Now here was this crooked little bracelet, imperfect, clumsy, but filled with more heart than anything he had. Held in years, the thought unsettled him. He had trained himself not to dwell on the past, not to feel, because feelings slowed you down. Feelings clouded judgment. Yet as he stared at the bracelet, feelings he had locked away clawed their way back. Grief, regret, loneliness. They swirled around him like shadows in the corners of his office. His mind kept circling back to the girl, Maya. She had looked at him as if he mattered. Not his money, not his name, not the suits or the penthouse or the bodyguards, just him, the tired man standing in the snow. He tried to push her face away, but it kept returning. The pink of her cheeks, the missing mitten, the steady voice that had asked him the question no one else ever had. That night he could not sleep. He lay in the dark, the city lights glowing faintly beyond the curtains, his mind refusing to quiet. He turned over, then sat up, then got out of bed altogether, walking barefoot through the silent apartment. Everywhere he went, the emptiness echoed. The dining table big enough for 12 but always set for one. The bookshelves lined with volumes he never read. The cold marble kitchen where no laughter ever rose. He ended up back at his desk, the bracelet still waiting for him. As though it had known he would return, he slid it onto his wrist without meaning to. The yarn stretched, awkward against his skin, but once it settled there, it felt as though it belonged. He raised his arm, staring at it, and in that simple moment he felt ridiculous and strangely comforted. Ridiculous because he was a billionaire wearing a child's bracelet. Comforted because it was the first thing in years that had not felt hollow. In the days that followed, James tried to return to normal. He threw himself into work, meetings, deals, stock updates, but the bracelet never left his wrist. His assistants noticed it but said nothing. Too afraid or too polite. Some board members raised eyebrows when they saw it during a video call, but James ignored them. What mattered to him was not their opinion, but the strange way this fragile piece of yarn seemed to anchor him. Still, his curiosity began to burn. Who was Maya really? Where did she live? What kind of life did she return to after leaving the park? He tried to convince himself that it was none of his business, but at night, when the silence pressed too heavily, he found himself imagining her world. Perhaps a small apartment, perhaps struggles her mother never spoke of, he thought. Of the missing mitten, the boots too large. The way her mother had looked tired from a distance, he could not stop thinking. And so one evening he did something he had not done in years. He stepped out of the tower of glass and steel and went back to Central Park. The cold bit harder, this time the wind sharper, but he did not notice. He stood near the same spot waiting, telling himself it was foolish that she might not come, that he had no reason to be there. But his feet refused to leave, and then he saw her again, the same little girl, skipping clumsily, her hat pulled down low, her mother walking behind with a grocery bag that looked far too heavy. James felt his breath catch, something inside him tightening. He told himself to turn away, to disappear before they noticed. But before he could, Maya spotted him. Her eyes widened, and she broke into a grin. "You wore it!" she shouted, pointing. At his wrist, her voice cutting through the air like a bell. James looked down at the bracelet, then back at her, and for the first time in years, he felt heat rising to his face, a blush he thought he had forgotten how to make. Her mother noticed him too, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. She moved closer to her daughter, her hand protective. "Maya," the woman said softly, "come here." But Maya shook her head, still staring at James. "He wore it, Mommy. He really wore it," she said, her voice full of delight. James hesitated, caught between leaving and stepping forward, his heart hammering. With an unfamiliar rhythm, he had faced boardroom wars, courtroom battles, hostile takeovers, but none of them had made him as nervous as standing in front of a little girl and her mother. He cleared his throat. "Your daughter gave me this," he said to the woman, lifting his wrist slightly. "I wanted to say thank you." The woman studied him, her eyes cautious, but beneath the weariness there was something else. Recognition. She knew his face. Of course she did. Everyone knew his face. But what she saw now was not the billionaire from the headlines, but a man standing, awkwardly, clutching a child's bracelet as if it were the most precious jewel. For a long moment no one spoke. The winter wind rustled the trees, The city roared faintly beyond the park, and then Maya giggled, breaking the tension. "I told you it would help," she said. James looked at her, and for the first time in many years he felt something he thought he had lost forever, the faint, fragile stirring of hope. The frozen heart. The city was wrapped in cold silence. Central Park lay under a blanket of frost, its trees skeletal against the pale winter sky. Snow crunched faintly under the boots of the few who dared to walk through the icy paths that morning. Among them was James Holloway, a man whose face had once appeared on magazine covers, whose name had been spoken in boardrooms with respect, fear, and envy. Now he walked with his shoulders heavy, his expensive coat doing little to shield him from the deeper chill that came not from the air, but from somewhere inside him. His breath rose in faint clouds. His eyes looked not at the path but at nothing, as if the world had blurred into meaningless shapes. James Holloway was a billionaire, but he was also a man who felt utterly poor in the one thing he could not buy. Warmth. He had money, he had houses, he had cars, but he did not have laughter echoing in his home. He did not have voices waiting for him when he returned at night. What he had were empty rooms, echoing silence, and a grief that pressed on him like a weight he could never put down. He had been this way for years, moving through days like a machine, running meetings, signing deals, smiling when required. But inside there was nothing. That morning, he had walked into the park without really knowing why. His office was calling, his schedule was packed, but he needed to escape the glass walls and the endless phone calls. So he wandered, not looking for anything, not expecting anything. And then he heard a voice. It was small, high, soft, but steady, like a whisper that cut through the fog inside him. "I think you need a hug. Can I hug you?" James froze, his head turning slowly as though the words had been unreal. But they had been real, and they came from a little girl standing only a few steps away. She could not have been older than 5 or 6. Her brown skin glowed against the whiteness of the snow, her cheeks pink from the cold, one mitten missing from her small hands, her boots a little too big, and her hat, knitted in clumsy bright yarn, sagged down over her forehead. She looked at him with wide eyes, steady, unafraid, as if she had known him forever. "What did you say?" James asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. The girl tilted her head as though his question was strange. "You look like you need a hug," she said again. "My mommy says hugs don't fix everything, but they help." James blinked, unable to recall the last time anyone had spoken to him so directly, so honestly. He had spent years surrounded by polished words, by people who wanted favors, by employees who feared him. No one told him he looked like he needed a hug. He gave a soft laugh, rusty, surprising even to himself. "That's pretty wise," he said. The girl's lips curved into a proud little smile. "I'm 5, she declared, then added quickly, "and a half." James smiled despite himself. "Well, thank you for the offer, Maya." He repeated her name softly, tasting its warmth on his tongue. "You should be with your mom. It's cold." She nodded, but instead of leaving, she glanced down at her wrist. She was wearing a colorful bracelet made of yarn and little plastic beads, the kind children make. With clumsy but loving hands, after a pause, she slid it off and held it out to him. "You should wear it," she said, her eyes shining with an authority far bigger than her small frame. "It will help you remember." "Remember what?" James asked, confused. "That hugs help," she said simply, her voice carrying no doubt. For a long moment, James stared at the bracelet. He wanted to tell her he couldn't, that it wasn't right, that he was a stranger, but the words did not come. His hand, large and trembling, reached out and he took it. The bracelet felt weightless, yet as it sat in his palm, it carried a weight he could not explain. "Thank you, Maya," he whispered, and for the first time in years, his voice cracked with something real. She grinned, then, without waiting for permission, she stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around his legs. Her hug was brief, clumsy, but it was real, warm and alive. Then she pulled back, waved, and ran off toward the figure of a woman waiting at a distance. James watched her go, his chest tight, his hand clutching the bracelet as if it were fragile glass. The woman called Maya's name, and together they disappeared into the thinning crowd of the park. He stood there for a long time, the snow falling quietly around him. His world had not shifted, and yet somehow it had. That night, back in his penthouse apartment, James sat alone in his vast living room, floor-to-ceiling windows looking over the glittering city. But the lights below seemed meaningless. He had poured himself a drink, but it sat untouched. His hand turned, instead, to the bracelet still clutched in his pocket. He pulled it out, placed it on the table before him. The colors bright against the polished wood. It looked so out of place in his world of glass and steel, and yet it seemed more valuable than any jewel he owned. James leaned back, his eyes wet with a sting he had forgotten how to feel. A little girl had seen him, truly seen him. Not the billionaire, not the headlines, but the man who was cold and empty inside. She had given him something no deal, no fortune, no empire ever had. A moment of human warmth. And he realized, as he sat staring at the bracelet under the glow of the city, that he was not the same man who had walked into the park that morning for the first time in years. He felt something, a crack in the ice around his heart, and through it, the faintest spark of warmth.